Okay, we have our animation complete for each of the pieces. I'm going to go ahead and play that now. Alright, and as you can see, we've taken some of the objects and just had them explode directly off of the planet and not just a separate explosion like we had this first one right here kind of go off first and then explode. And we still kind of did it with some of the other ones, but in order to add variation, we have some of the pieces just directly coming off the object and twisting and rotating around. And if you take a look at this the main planet that's left over, which is this little piece right here, we just kind of have it rotating a little bit at the end. We're mostly probably just going to be dissolving that, which would be the only object that we're going to dissolve out of the scene. And we might do that just when we have a couple explosions in here, making it bright enough for us to dissolve that out and you not really see it. And that's just so it doesn't really look like there's anything left behind, because it is kind of a weird shaped object. What is left behind, even though we could go in to modeler, of course, and cut that up into different pieces, we want to keep our amount of pieces right now that we have kind of low, just so it's a lot easier to calculate and we don't have too much to render. I'm going to do a quick render really quick just to show you what we did to our planet surface, and we did change it a little bit. As you can see, it's a lot more lively now. All we really did was took our diffuse map that we had before and we copied it, and we went ahead and pasted it on top of the turbulence layer we had, set its blending mode to multiply and its layer opacity down to 55, and that just gives it a lot more detail as far as the color goes, and it looks a little more like a planet now. I also went and changed the color and made it just a little bit darker just on that main color section. And also there's one other thing I did to the cut surface, and that is I gave it diffuse sharpness of 63, which is about what it is for the planet surface, and that way once it's getting broken up it will have the same diffuse sharpness or large scale diffuse as the rest of the object. And do another quick render just with the object opened up so you can kind of see inside. You can see all these charred pieces in the inside and all that. And like I was saying before, that's actually going to show up a lot more once we start adding our point lights for each one of our explosions. So we have our animation set up, and now we can start adding our particles for dynamics. And we're going to be using HV particles. So we want to start out with select an object mode. And we select planet 1-1. And we're just going to work our way through adding our dynamics to each object. So we're going to open the objects panel, and under dynamic, with that object selected, we're going to make sure we're going to select emitter, and then we're going to geometry, and we're going to select HyperVoxels drawing. And what that's going to do is remove the particles from rendering in the scene and make it so that they only show up as HyperVoxels. Okay. And there's really not too much editing we have to do to the actual particles themselves. There's one thing I want to note: we don't want to be calculating the particles at all in the scene, just because we want them to kind of, as you can see, they're rolling off at this object right here. And if we were to calculate that, they wouldn't roll directly off the object. If I calculate them right now, if you can see right there, they kind of start shooting down around through here. And instead of really having to go through all the settings and really deal with it to make it so that it's continuously rolling, all we're going to do is just undo the calculation and not calculate any of the particles at all, because anything we get from it should be fine, and we shouldn't really have to worry about it too much. Okay, there are a few things we have to change, and we're going to select the fixed, making sure that we are in the properties. And our start frame, we're going to have to set each start frame to whenever that piece kind of blows off. And in this case, we have it set to 100. So we're going to set that start frame to 100. And this is a large object, so a birth rate of 100 with particle limit of 1000 is fine. We will vary the birth rates depending on the size of the object, depending on how much is going to be coming off of it. Most of the default settings in here are just fine. We can set our time limit though, we want to change that to 210. Even though this one only starts at 100, doesn't really need to go that far, we still want to make sure that we set everything to 210 just so it's lasting out throughout the whole scene. Okay, just checking that particle resistance. The more you change the particle resistance, the higher number you make, the more the particles are left behind as the object moves. And we want this one's sort of towards the end of the scene, and that's fine where it's at. Like I said, the default settings for this are fine. We don't need to add gravity or anything like that since we're out in the middle of space. And the only gravity there is the planet, which is kind of already sucking that in, but most planets being exploded anyway. Particle weight of 1 is fine, and pretty much all the other settings are fine for that. And what we're going to do is just go ahead and do the same thing to every single object, every single piece, except for the main planet and the planet cut. We'll leave those the way they are, but we'll go through and just add those dynamics to every single one of the pieces. And then we're going to go ahead and open up HyperVoxels and edit the fire effect that's going to be on there. So we're selecting the next object now. Go to Emitter, Geometry, HyperVoxels Drawing, and now we're going to the properties for that emitter. And this is a lot smaller of an object, so we don't need as many particles. But this is also starting at 100, so we'll set this fixed 100. And we're going to change our particle time to, 210. Okay. And generator, we'll set that to 75. And that's just because it's a little bit smaller of an object, and we won't need as many particles to define the hypervoxels for it. And of course our particle resistance right there is fine. We don't really need to worry about explosion or vibration for these specific particles, just because it's pretty straightforward what we're going to be doing with them, and that's just pretty much adding a little trail of hypervoxels fire behind each one of them. So once it explodes, they turn into pretty much giant fireballs, consuming everything around them. Alright, we'll move on to the next one. And Objects panel, under Dynamics, add Emitter, Geometry, HyperVoxels, Drawing, Custom, and that will. And one thing to change, when you are selecting the HyperVoxels drawing, it will change and say HyperVoxels Custom Object. So you are putting in the right emitter, or the right selection if it changes like that. It's just a little bit different. And some of these, of course, depending on their speed, you might want to add a few more particles to it, just because you don't want to leave too many particles behind and not have a correct looking fireball. And that's looking good. And this is, we're going to end up with a lot of particles in the end of this scene, just because we're also going to be using particles for our extra little bits of debris and for sparks and things like that. Okay. And we'll just go around through the rest of the model, the rest of the pieces of the model, and go ahead and just add our dynamics just like we did for these first three. And all you got to do is just vary your birth rates. 1,000 particles should be fine because it's not a very long animation, and I doubt any will run out. If you want, you can change to 2,000 if you're emitting more than 200 particles per second. But I wouldn't really worry about it. For maybe this big object down here, you might want to set that to maybe 200 particles per second, and maybe 150, and just vary it as you go along. Okay, we have all of our particles set up for every single piece that's exploding, except that central part right here. And now we need to add hypervoxels to each one. and we're just going to be adding the same effect to every single one to make it a lot easier. And we just need to define one of the areas, define one of the object's particles, and then apply that. So what we want to do is grab an object that is in the scene longer than the rest of them, and so it's going to need to be probably this one right here. And that's just so we can figure out where we need to dissolve it and how long it needs to be. Alright, I'm going to hit Control F6 to pull up our volumetrics panel under Effects, and select HyperVoxels. I also want to enable the Viper and hit F7 on the keyboard to pull up our Viper. And then I'm going to double click on HyperVoxels, and we need to know what object we have selected here, so it's 3-1. So we're going to double click on 3-1, and now we have our voxels shown. And I'm going to get it so we can see the front, or see the whole object. Alright, and now we can just use one of the presets and edit to our liking. And in order to open the presets, just want to hit F8, and that'll pull up our preset panel. And I have two monitors, so this stuff's jumping up on the second monitor where I normally have it. That's why I had to pull it over. And under Workspace, I select Fire and Smoke, and you just select the Fire-ish preset, which comes with every Lightwave version from 6 and up ever since HyperVoxels came out. They really haven't added too many presets. I'll include the preset just in case you don't have it. I'll make sure that's on the disk for you. Okay, and when it asks you, when you double click on it, it asks you if you want to change the size. You just go ahead and click yes on that. And we can, as you can see here, we can change our particle size. We want to dissolve, because we don't want this to be too bright, and using dissolve is probably the best way to do it. You could also change luminosity, but that's used by a texture right now, so we'd have to go in and edit that. And the best way to do it is just dissolve, and that way we can see all the other fire behind it as well. As far as the size of the texture, the scale, it's set to 1.5 right now, and that seems to actually be okay. We're going to go ahead and make that a little bit bigger. So what do we have? We have about 451 millimeters per voxel. We also want to change our texture effect, and we're going to change that to dissolve and expand. And that's just so we don't have to worry about fading out each voxel as it reaches a certain age. And we want to change our effect speed on that, so it's not doing it too quickly. And we'll go all the way to the end, the animation, and see what it looks like. And we want it so it's just barely fading out as we reach the end. And that way we know we'll have it correct for all the other pieces in the scene. Okay, and that looks pretty good. I'll go ahead now and do a quick render just to show how that looks on that one piece. And actually I'm going to escape and undo that and pull out the time slider a little bit more so you can actually see that object, and go ahead and render it again. Okay, and it's just showing right now just that one set of hypervoxels that we have. And this gives a real nice fiery look to it. You get a nice fireball effect. And because of the way our lighting is right now, we're kind of behind the shadows of where the object is. You can still kind of see it in here, but not too much. So we could, of course, edit that. You can see we still have some fire over here coming from the outside, but that looks like it's going to be okay. So we're going to go ahead now and just apply this fire effect to the entire every single object in the scene that will be using it. So we can go ahead and right mouse click. Oh, can't do it in here. Click copy. Once we have that selected. And actually, there is one thing I did want to change. The contrast we want to make a little bit higher. And that's for the one we're working on right now. Just 'cause we do want to do a little bit of editing to what's already there, and maybe the frequencies will change just a little. So we have a lot better of a fire effect, because it was a little too smoothed out. And then we'll make it just a little bit bigger because of that. And there we go. Frequencies 2, contrast 9. Make sure our texture is turbulence, small power of 0.75 like it was before. Texture amplitude is 100. The effect, dissolve and expand. Make sure effect speed is at 25%. Geometry, 476 millimeter. Shading, we can keep all these default settings. The lights, for right now, we're just going to use the distant light. That's all we really need. It's fire. It's going to be creating its own light, and we don't want all the other lights affecting it anyway. So now we can go ahead and select this copy and go ahead and paste it. Making sure we double click on the object first and then hit paste. And what that's going to do is just activate the object first and then paste it onto the particles. You can still get a preview too here in our Viper. And with that dissolve, it gives a real nice, because before, if we didn't have it dissolved, it would be a very bright yellow. And we want kind of a nice, rich orange. And that looks like we got them all. So I can close out that. And now we're going to do a test render just to see how everything kind of looks together at about 160, frame 160. So I'll go ahead and render that. Okay, here's our finished frame. And overall, everything looks pretty good. There is a little bit of a... We have this very yellow section through here and here, and that's mostly caused by the fact that we have so many particles in here, just because we have two objects, or actually three objects right next to each other, all emitting particles, this whole section, all kind of together. So what we can do to fix that, if you want, you can select that set of particles in HyperVoxels and maybe add a little bit to the dissolve. But I kind of like having that extra brightness right there. It really shows the contrast, plus it balances out the scene a little bit more. And we're getting a lot of shadows in here, and you can't really see a lot of the objects, so we could try changing the lighting just a little. Actually, most of our objects are showing up pretty well. Once we start adding the point lights, that should take care of a lot of that. Okay, I'll close that out. Okay, and now what we're going to do is start adding our point lights. And we're going to add a point light to each and every explosion, and we'll be setting up in multiple layers, and each point light is going to have volumetric options on. And what we'll be doing is one point will be the overall explosion, which is going to be kind of a quick burst of light, which will then fade out, which won't be affected by shadows. And then we're going to have another one that will affect the shadows, so we get kind of light rays shining through certain areas, and that way it'll give us a really neat looking effect. So we're going to start out with the first point light, and just like items, light, point light. And we want to name this light EX for explosion 001. And actually we might even go ahead and just copy and paste those later, so that 001 doesn't really matter too much. We'll be paying attention to its clones. We want to make sure we set this to 0 right now, and we want to move this into place to where the first explosion is going to be, or at least the first explosion on this part. I'm going to set this perspective view and hit this little button right here, which is going to center the viewport entirely to whatever we have selected, which in this case it's our point light. So what it's going to do is put that in the center of the scene constantly, no matter where we move the camera and no matter how we rotate it. And we might need to pull that in just a little bit more, because it is a rather large piece we're breaking off. And what we're doing is we're going to add a volumetric light in the center right here, and it's going to cast light rays out of each one of these cracks once that light reaches the point where it's outside of an object. Right now it's still kind of inside of an object, so we want to make sure we move it in just a little bit more, just to the point where pretty close to the early part of the animation that it will be uncovered and outside of an object, because otherwise with shadows on we won't get effect out of it at all. Okay, so that's going to be where our first light is. So now we're going to open up our light panel. So Shift and L, make sure light's selected, and hit P, open up the properties. And we're going to turn Viper back on, and open it up by hitting F7, and we're going to select volumetric lighting. And for this we're also going to be using a preset. So hit F8 to pull up our presets, and we're going to select a point light preset, and we're going to use the gaseous. And yes, change the size parameters. And we're going to increase our radius. And this we're mostly worried about. We don't really have to worry about this side too much because there's going to be a lot of shadows created. And we just want to get these nice light rays coming out, and we're going to be dissolving this after a certain point, so we don't really have to worry about it throughout the whole scene, because if we had several of these lights, 10 of them or so, it's going to really flood the scene. I'm going to increase our luminosity to a rather high amount just because there are going to be so many shadows, and of course, like I said, it will be blocked out by shadows. We want to change our quality to best, and that'll not only get rid of a lot of that distortion once the shadows come into play. When you're ray tracing shadows from a volumetric light, you want to make sure you have your quality to the best. Unless it's a really, really complex texture and it'll take forever to render, you're going to want to set that to the highest quality just so we don't get vertical banding, which, you can get some pretty weird looking distortions once it's rendered. And I'm just going to adjust this. We don't need it to be quite so large. And just looking at kind of the end here to see exactly where the light beams are going to be shooting out at. And maybe just a little bit bigger. And of course up our luminosity. And the attenuation will increase just a little. And now we have a nice central glow in the center right here. And we're going to go ahead and render that about right here, and we can take a look and see how it affects the object. And then we'll go ahead and render it a little bit farther down the line to see how it affects the rest of the objects. But of course, like I said, we'll be dissolving that out at a certain point. And I'm just going to double check again to make sure that it's not inside of any objects, and you're looking at the most central point. And just want to make sure nothing's intersecting with it, otherwise we'll get some very harsh shadows to the point where you won't even be able to see the object or the lights. Alright, so I'm going to render this now. Render frame. Okay, we have our finished frame here. And if you notice, most of it's just shooting out from the bottom. And that's mostly because this large section right here, when it's kind of coming out, it's almost intersecting. If you take a look here, it's almost intersecting with this top part right here, and it pretty much is. So we're only going to get light beams from what can shine through without shadows going on it. And I went ahead and went a few frames forward and started rendering. And you can see some of the beams coming out of the top now, and a little bit more on the sides. We also have a nice glow on the inside, as if it's kind of on fire. And I know this looks a little weird with just these little HyperVoxel individual ones on the kind of the outside right here, even though it's not really a full fireball yet. But a lot of that's going to be covered up by the extra lights that we add in here, because we are going to add another volumetric light for this explosion. Like I said, we're going to be doubling it up. And that's the other reason we're going to do that, is that way we'll get a nice glow, which would be pretty much a reaction. If you're to film this in real life, you get a reaction with the camera where this is going to glow over the edge right here. But right now we have a kind of a clean cut edge, and there's no glow, even though there's obviously a large fire change right here. It doesn't seem to be reacting at all with any of the outside spots, and that's just because of the way the shadows are. But we want kind of a glow almost like this around this kind of edge. And by adding another light in there and not having shadows on, we'll be able to add that glow. Of course, we'll be fading it out pretty quickly, and it's only going to last a little bit. And we also need to have that too, because if we were to watch this as an animation right now, you'd notice that these pieces started to come off, and then they kind of started on fire a little bit, and then these light beams would break through. And it's kind of a large delay because of that, because of the way the shadows are, and it's not an immediate burst of light, and that's mostly just because of the shadows. So what we need to do is just create a light without the shadows. And we're also going to figure out exactly when we want to fade this one out. And we also might want to increase the luminosity on that, just so we get a lot brighter of a light beam shooting out through here. And I think that one should really fade out about right here, because we're also going to have, there's going to be so many explosions in the scene that it doesn't really need to last very long to get that kind of effect all over, because we are going to have, because there's another explosion down here, so we're going to be adding another light down here with light rays. We're also going to be adding another one over here. Once we get around to the top, there's going to be one for that back section right there shooting light beams out, and this section right here, this large one, and as well on the side over here, and anything else, especially this one right here, that's going to be another one. And then it's hopefully we'll have enough in here in the center where we can just dissolve out this last remaining piece, which is kind of like the frame of what's left, Hopefully we'll be able to dissolve that out, and you won't really be able to tell just because there'll be so much in the scene, and not to mention with all the little debris we're going to be adding and all the sparks and little particles effects. So right now we're going to open up actually the envelope for this luminosity on this light. So we're going to go back to our light properties. So Shift L and then hit P on the keyboard and open up volumetric lighting. And I think we're going to want to fade this out because we are going to have another thing right here. We'll fade it out. I'd say, yeah, we could probably fade it out at frame 60, and it'll last about 30 frames total. Actually, a little bit less than that, just because you won't be able to see it the first 7 frames or so. So I'm going to hit the E next to luminosity, but first I'm going to actually pull up the Viper, just so we can take a look at it. Alright, and now I'm going to hit, like I said, the E next to luminosity. I'll pull our graph editor over here, and I'll just size that down a little and show this volumetric light. And we're going to want to create a key. Since this is the first explosion, and if the object is completely concealed, we're not even going to need to dissolve it to begin with. We will for the other lights, but this is the first light, and the first keyframe can be at well, we're going to want to fade it out over a couple of frames, so we're going to want to create a keyframe around 50. And we got it at 51, and we'll just change that to 50. As far as this little bit of movement we added in here, it's not really a big deal. It'll just be getting a tiny little bit brighter before it ends up fading out at 60, which we'll add a point at 60 now. And there we go. And now we're going to T to move, or you can hit this little thing right here, and we'll move that down. And we could even just change that value to 0. And we'll use our navigation up here to kind of take a look at it. If you notice, it's curving up and then going down, so it's getting a lot brighter and then dims out. And that's actually okay. That's going to be kind of a neat effect, but I might want to edit that just a little bit, so I'm going to right mouse click on that and change that to a Bezier spline. And then I can go and edit exactly how much we want it to lift up and how long we want it to gradually go upward. And we'll bring it down just a little, and then we'll have a nice dissolve. So at frame 60, it'll be completely gone. And actually, now that I'm looking at it, we might want to dissolve it out a little bit later. And that's just because the pieces aren't really coming out that much right here. Of course, it is a little bit farther than what shows up in Viper, because this isn't our scene right now. This is what we had rendered, or the last render is what's put into Viper. So this was, I believe, frame 45 or so, around right there. So actually, yeah, we'll leave it at 60. Just gotta keep in mind that this isn't exactly how the looks right now. We're just kind of using that to show where the volumetric light is. And yeah, it would be fading out about this point. And like I said before, at 0, of course, if we render it with Viper, it's obviously going to show up. But if I was to render it right now and show you, and I'm not going to let this finish all the way because it's going to take a little while because it's still trying to render the volumetrics, which aren't really in the scene. But this is what it's going to look like. It's just going to render it with the shadows. It's going to cut out all that light. So we really don't need to dissolve it before the point of the actual explosion. The other ones we will need to, though. So I'm going to abort that. And before I do anything else, I'm going to go ahead and save this, just to make sure we don't lose any information. And what we're going to be doing now is going ahead and just kind of copying this light and moving it to where all the other lights, or the other explosions, will be.